When we speak about the Renaissance, we almost instinctively turn to Florence or to Paris. The story is usually told as an Italian spark that ignited Europe, but at times it may seem like that spark fades as it moves eastward. But beyond the Alps and the lands across Eastern Europe, it produced developments just as rich, but that took on quite a different form. And these developments were shaped by a very different set of historical circumstances. Welcome back to Threads of Time. In today's video, we're exploring the Renaissance in Eastern Europe and what it looked like when viewed not just as a cultural movement, but as a product of both geography and the sheer need for survival. The Renaissance depiction we're used to typically includes a couple of things: a revival of classical learning, the rise of humanist education, the championing of the individual, and increased patronage from secular elites. It is also important to remember that this revival of classical learning didn't happen in isolation. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, many Greek scholars and manuscript copyists fled westward, carrying with them ancient texts that have been preserved in Byzantine libraries and monasteries for centuries. Their arrival in Italian cities helped reintroduce Western Europe to the forgotten works of Plato, Aristotle, and other classical authors. In this sense, the Renaissance spark in the West was, in part at least, a transmission from the East. Thinkers and artists became fascinated by the idea that a person could stand on their own and be celebrated for their own achievements, even at times entirely detached from society, faith, or historical context. From the workshops of Italy, these ideas then spread across France, Spain, England, and the Low Countries. However, when we carry that same framework east of the Alps, the story becomes a bit more complex. Eastern European Renaissance culture, by contrast, placed the individual firmly within a broader context. The individual existed as part of a living history and held personal responsibility within his or her nation. Rulers and artists were recognized not just for their own personal brilliance, but for how their work served the stability, identity, and moral order of their nations. Renaissance developments unfolded in nations that faced constant external pressures that at times threatened their very existence. Patronage, therefore, was more selective, and cultural projects were more frequently tied to legitimizing political order or to ensuring religious continuity would be sustained. Renaissance ideas were closely tied to the courts of each nation's ruler. King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary offers a clear example of this. He recruited Italian humanists, built the renowned Biblioteca Corviniana, which was one of the largest libraries in Europe outside of Italy, and integrated scholars directly into royal administration. Humanist learning helped refine legal reforms throughout the nation, while also refining the way that royal authority was presented to its people. In Buda in particular, architectural commissions made by the court and its emphasis on humanist scholarship transformed the city into a melting pot of intellectual development. Further east, in Wallachia and Moldova, rulers like Stephen the Great and Vlad the Impaler expressed Renaissance influence in slightly different ways. Their patronage focused less on secular humanism and more on fortified religious complexes, and this was because these religious fortifications served both spiritual and defensive purposes. Where in Italy, we might see Michelangelo's David as an independent hero symbolizing human potential in a vacuum, on the frescoes of a Moldovan monastery, we would see rulers, saints, and ordinary people painted side by side as part of a single continuous narrative. Each individual's work or their piety matters because of their connection to the whole. In these spaces, the artwork still absorbed Renaissance motifs like the attention to proportions or ornamental designs. However, these elements were carefully layered onto the already existing conventions of Byzantine art. Western ideas did not displace older forms of expression. Instead, they complemented them, enriching their visual impact without altering its foundations. The result was a style that was less an imitation of Italian art and more of a hybrid style that married together the religious landscape with the constant demands of defense. In the eastern reaches of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Ostro Academy in modern Ukraine developed as a very unique kind of Renaissance institution. What made the Ostro Academy unique in the Renaissance context was that it was primarily shaped by the practical needs of Orthodox Christianity, rather than by the pursuit of humanist art or secular culture. Its curriculum centered on the mastery of languages and their application in learning about logic and moral philosophy. Students here were trained in Greek, Latin, Hebrew, and Church Slavonic, which allowed them to move easily between both works of the classical era and modern Western scholarship. Classical authors were studied for their clarity of argument and rhetorical structure, not necessarily as models to be copied and pasted onto their current society. These humanist methods function in large part as supporting tools for the Christian theology that was at the center of the Ostro Academy's curriculum. Classical authors were read alongside the Bible, church history, and the writings of the early church fathers. They were not treated as alternatives to religious learning, but rather as a tool for clear argument and theological debate. The education students received at Ostro prepared them for service within the church, the law offices, military, and diplomacy, with humanism functioning less as a cultural identity in and of itself and more as a tool of practicality. Across Eastern Europe, Renaissance learning became a means of reinforcing authority and preserving identity, and these priorities were inseparable from the geopolitical context of the times. Unlike Western Europe, where even devastating wars rarely threatened the very existence of a nation, Eastern Europe existed on a knife's edge. France could endure invasions and internal revolts, but it would still remain France. Its identity was secure and embedded in centuries of territorial continuity. By contrast, their eastern neighbors faced a far more precarious reality. One failed campaign, one unfavorable treaty could completely erase borders and impose a foreign rule that would seek to dismantle centuries of culture and faith. Following the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Ottoman expansion pushed deep into the Balkans and Central Europe, while to the north, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was seeking to expand their influence ever outwards. The scars of previous eastern invasions from the steppe nomads had also not yet fully healed. Many lands fell under foreign domination or were constantly contested. In the Balkans, Serbia and Albania were gradually absorbed into the Ottoman Empire. In these lands, prolonged warfare and eventual Ottoman incorporation limited large-scale patronage, but even so, cultural production still persisted through the Albanian diaspora population and the monastic communities across Serbia. Albanian scholar Marin Barleti, who was writing in Latin in the early 16th century, produced a biography of Skanderbeg that was widely circulated throughout Renaissance Europe. Meanwhile, Arboresh communities in southern Italy preserved Albanian literary traditions, linking their Balkan identity to the wider humanist world centered around the Adriatic Sea. In Bosnia, Ottoman incorporation into the culture of the land led to a different form of cultural expression. Sarajevo developed into a major urban center, marked by institutions such as the Gazi Husrev Beg Mosque and its associated library, and the madrasa schools of the 16th century. Cultural life here still continued, though it became shaped more by Ottoman influence than by Italian humanism. Looking towards the north and the east, much of modern Belarus and Ukraine came under the influence of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, while regions such as Hungary, Wallachia, and Transylvania became seemingly permanent borderlands, holding on to their sovereignty by a thread, facing repeated invasions and necessary militarization. Maintaining frontier defenses required fortresses, garrisons, cavalry forces, supply networks, and heavy taxation. Cultural patronage existed, but it could never be detached from military readiness. A person traveling across Eastern Europe will notice how densely these lands are marked with fortified structures. Scattered across the hills and rising at the heart of towns stand fortresses and walled monasteries. In Serbia, fortresses like Smederevo marked the last defensive stand that the medieval Serbian state had before its fall to the Ottomans in 1459. Further north in the Ukrainian lands, castles such as the Kamenets-Podilsky and the fortress at Kotin guarded vital border crossings between the Ottoman and Polish-Lithuanian lands. In Moldova, monasteries like Sucevica and Neamț were constructed with thick defensive walls and watchtowers, behind which the population of the nearby towns could take refuge during times of conflict. These structures were not designed to be elegant or ornamental. Their thick stone walls and narrow bastion towers might at times seem severe in their appearance, but what mattered is that within their walls, townspeople, artists, scholars, and clerics alike could be protected. These frontier conditions held the leading motive of why the Renaissance looked the way that it did in these different regions of Europe. By absorbing the constant military pressures in the east and the south, Eastern European states functioned as a defensive buffer for much of the Western Europe. Resources in Italy, France, and the Low Countries could flow more easily into universities or into artistic experiments, partly because their eastern neighbors carried a majority share of the defensive burden. Where surplus and stability prevailed, Renaissance culture expanded outwards. Where survival was uncertain, it adapted inwards. Examining the Renaissance across Europe reveals that cultural flourishing is never isolated from the conditions that sustain it. And recognizing this interconnectedness helps us to see the Renaissance not as a single uniform movement, but as a constellation of regionally distinctive developments, each shaped by their own unique needs and priorities. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments if there's anything you'd like to add, or if there's anything new that you learned today, I would love to hear about it. Otherwise, if you've enjoyed today's video, you can give it a like down below, and if you're a fan of all things history and culture east of the Alps, I do hope you'll consider subscribing as well. Thank you again, and I will see you in the next video.